Hi, this is Robert Rickover. I'm an Alexander Technique teacher in Lincoln, Nebraska. I teach in Toronto, Canada, and right now I teach pretty much all online. My guest today is Mio Morales. Mio is a second generation Alexander teacher. He trained with Dr. Frank Pierce Jones and Marjorie Barstow from 1972 to 1993. And since 2013, he's been teaching exclusively over the internet, developing Primal Alexander, which is the first comprehensive Alexander technique training system dedicated to the teaching and marketing of the Alexander technique online. Welcome, Mio.
Hi, Robert.
Hey, good to talk to you. I
Yeah,
should add that Mio and I have known each other for at least 40 years, I would guess.
yeah,
We both were students of Marjorie Barstow. Before we start our conversation, could you uh, give our listeners a very short description or definition of the Alexander technique?
sure. For me, the Alexander technique is a way of a person understanding how they interfere at different times with their natural overall coordination, how they can recognize that interference, and then how, upon recognizing it, they can consciously make choices which will make it easier for them to move and do things and also improve their overall general coordination.
Yep, that sounds good. That's now, you for the last number of years have chosen to teach pretty much entirely online, right?
That's right.
And I have chosen since the beginning of this year to teach entirely online. And before we get into the your particular approach to the work, do you want to say a word or two about the pros and cons of online teaching?
Yeah, sure. Well, the big con is that in a sense it's a con that you can't have the usual kind of physical contact that
Hmm.
you have with a student. You can't use your hands.
Right.
Uh, I think that that's not necessarily a bad thing that you can't use your hands
I would agree. I would agree with that.
because when you think about it, Alexander made his discoveries without receiving hands on. He did it completely by using his thinking, experimenting in front of mirrors, and gradually developing a kind of vocabulary or a system where he could test out different ways of thinking and then see what happened. He would watch the mirrors and notice what would happen, what he could see, and also he would listen to the sound of his voice because he was experimenting with his voice. So
Mhm.
it's not unusual. It's not an area of Alexander teaching that has been explored as much as the hands on stuff has, but I'm finding it to be very, very potent and powerful, as I'm sure you are as well.
Absolutely. I actually, necessity has brought a number of a many more Alexander technique teachers to be teaching online. And I hear from a lot of them on Facebook, on the Facebook pages and just conversations. And an awful lot of them are just amazed at how effective it is. My own personal opinion is that for the majority of students, it's better than in-person teaching. Although I have to say, there have been occasions when I would love to have had my hands reach out and show a student exactly what I was talking about, but that's pretty rare in my experience.
Yeah.
And I imagine, do you find, as I do, that students learn faster online? And I
Sure.
think that's because they know they're a student. It's absolutely clear. They're not going to get a fix from the teacher. They got to work on their own. So your system of teaching, Primal Alexander, is I from what I know of it, and I have actually explored some simple aspects of it, and I have some thoughts on it. We could talk about it if you want. I've benefited from it, so I'm
Sure.
I'm becoming as someone who's actually explored it. But could you maybe say a little about what you do with your version, let's say, of the Alexander technique?
Sure. Um, a bunch of years ago, maybe 30 years ago, by accident, I stumbled upon something which at the time I didn't think was that important.
Hmm.
It was interesting to me because at that time I was, of course, a hands on Alexander teacher. But basically, I noticed in a conversation with a student after class that when I asked her to tell me where in her body she noticed tension, she pulled back and down more. When I asked her, so if you have tension in your shoulder, is there any place in your body where you feel a little bit easier? And as soon as she started to process that question, her head moved forward and up and her body followed.
Hmm.
And that was amazing to me, but it was only a little bit of movement. It wasn't a big change. And I was used to working with people, and we worked with Marjorie Barstow, who was a magician when it came to inducing these incredibly powerful dramatic changes. So I kind of didn't think it was that important. Oh yeah, it was a little bit of a change, but hands-on is better. That's essentially. But what I missed at the time was the idea that she was doing it on her own, that I didn't use my hands, that I just used my voice and words and getting her to think in a certain way that made the difference.
Yeah.
So that's how I discovered it. But it wasn't until I had done some online teaching quite a bit, little bits and pieces when Skype first happened in
Hmm.
2003, and then of course when Zoom happened, I started teaching Zoom. That was like in 2011 or so. But in 2013, I went to do a workshop for Jeremy Chance in Japan, and I met a bunch of Alexander students there who wanted to keep studying. So I thought, well, this is a great opportunity. I can't go to Japan. Why don't I just try teaching them, actually training them, because they wanted to learn how to teach this way. Why don't I just go ahead and train them and see what happens? And that's when it started. And then I started to realize, well, I should offer this to other Alexander teachers. They might find it useful. And that's basically how I got started with doing it.
Hmm. But you don't just work with Alexander teachers, right? You work
No,
with.
I work with I most of my students right now because of the COVID crisis are Alexander teachers.
Hmm.
Right. So I'm really, yeah. So I have a bunch of teachers that I've been teaching since March of last year.
Hmm. So what you've done is, could it be described as expanding on that idea that by that first student asking herself where do I notice ease or where do I feel easier, making a little change, you've kind of expanded on that. My sense is that you've expanded on it by multiple repetitions of that uh, thought.
That's right. Well, I teach something called the cycle,
Hmm.
which is just a very simple process, not involved with any movement or activity,
Hmm.
where a person simply asks that question four times, essentially four times on each finger.
Right.
So in a course of about 3 minutes, we do about 40 questions,
Hmm.
and they're just basically asking the question and then noticing what effect it has on them.
Hmm.
And it's the first in my series of etudes, which are just studies or exercises that I give students to do so that they can really develop the ability to explore how thinking a question like that can affect the way that their body moves.
Hmm. And how would you, let's say, an Alexander teacher listening to our conversation right now might say, how come you're not working with someone moving, doing an activity.
Well, I do work with people moving. The cycle is kind of the reason why I don't, the reason why I introduce it without movement is because it simplifies the awareness process for a student because
Hmm.
they're not engaged in moving. They're not getting the kinesthetic feedback from movement. They're just sitting quietly and just developing the skill of observation of themselves, of what happens when they ask the question, and then noticing if they see a change as a result. But that's only the first step,
Hmm.
right? The cycle, very soon I take them into an activity called MJ, which basically teaches them through activity the idea and the practice of inhibition.
Hmm. Right. Well, my experience, I've used the cycle uh,
Hmm.
version of it taught by a couple of your students, and I use it. I've used it mainly when going for walks, and I find what I found is that it seems to work best if I really have no interest in noticing any immediate effects. In fact, I just put the thoughts out there,
Hmm.
and occasionally I might experiment with the kind of process I use with a lot of my online students, which is to use a direction and then deliberately throw it away and then bring it back again and see what happens when you throw it away. And I've done that with myself. And I notice, yep, the walking gets a little heavier when I switch to a nonsense thought that takes me away from the where do I notice ease
Hmm.
thought.
Yeah.
And I have actually explored that with quite a few students online as well. I've had them use it not in the cycle format, but just a kind of just think that thought for a few seconds and then switch over to a nonsense thought and then bring it back and
Right.
just see what happens. And they pretty much all can notice a change as well.
Hmm.
So do you want to say more given our limited time frame, but do you want to say more about some of the more um, maybe call them advanced versions of the cycle? You mentioned MJ, which stands for
Sure.
Michael Jordan, right?
Michael Jackson, too.
Michael Jackson as well. Okay, sure. Any others that you want to touch upon a bit?
Well, MJ is a good one.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in MJ, basically, the movement is very simple. It's three parts. You're with your arms down at your side.
Hmm.
So you can do this with me if you like.
Sure.
On one, you bring your arms here with your hands relaxed at your wrists.
Right.
And then on two, your hands come up. And on three, you just lower everything down. Okay. So that
Hmm.
basic movement is what I teach in the first lesson. One, two,
Hmm. Yeah.
three.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then there's a sequence that I go through, and I go through it very slowly over a period of weeks where they do that the first week, and all they do is that simple movement just four times. I give homework to all of my students very clearly. They have to do the cycle twice a day, and they have to go through whatever other etudes we're doing at that point. But MJ is the second one that I teach. Okay, so
Hmm.
they do that twice a day. Then the next thing I do is I have them. The next time is I have them go. When I give a number, they don't do any movement. They just say the word pause out loud.
Hmm.
So the second stage is one, pause, two, pause, three, pause. And I have them practice that for a period of time. The next step is I have them say pause and then move. So the third stage is one, pause, move, two, pause, move, and so on. The fourth stage is they stop saying pause out loud. They simply, when they hear the get the stimulus to move, the number, they pause and then they move. Okay. Then On the fifth stage of it, I have them, instead of just thinking pause, they pause and then they think, where else do I seem a bit easy? And then they move. Where else do I seem a bit easy? And then they move. Oops. Okay. So basically, what I'm teaching them to do is first to turn inhibition or pausing into something very specific and very simple as an activity,
Mm-hmm.
taking a movement that they don't have very much attachment to. They're just moving their
Mm-hmm.
arms, very simple, very easy to
Mm-hmm.
do,
Mm-hmm.
and then squeezing in. Oh, I'm sorry, that's my daughter calling. Um, just squeezing in the constructive thinking, right,
Mm-hmm.
in
Mm-hmm.
between each. As they develop through their training, they start to notice, wow, when I think, where else do I seem? I think I'm going to have to answer this. I hope it's not something. Hello, Maya, I got to go. I'm in the middle of an interview, so I'll call you later. Bye, sweetheart. The idea is that from doing the cycle on a regular basis over a period of time, when they begin to ask that question, they start to have the sensitivity to notice that something begins to change in them, that they
Mm-hmm.
get a little bit easy. Of course, in the beginning, I don't emphasize them noticing anything except simply doing the thinking the way you were describing it without having an objective in mind.
Mm-hmm.
But then gradually, what they're able to do is they're able to, when they think constructively, they have an experience. And then as they begin to move, they can notice how that experience changes as they begin to move. In other words, by getting easier at the beginning of a movement before they move, they can find out whether they interfere with their coordination as they begin to move.
Mm-hmm.
And all of the other etudes, I think there are 12 other basic etudes, all sort of get them to practice doing constructive thinking, as Marge described, constructive conscious control, and noticing what happens. If they notice themselves interfering, they simply come back to the constructive thinking again, and the process goes on.
Oh, okay. Right. So, um, more movements, these later etudes are like more elaborate movements, for example.
Yeah. Okay, so that's MJ. The third one I do is called twisties,
Mm-hmm.
where they you bring your hands up, and this, as opposed to the other ones, are quick movements,
Mm-hmm.
right? So they're doing this kind of twisting. They're raising and lowering their arms, and then doing a twisting movement.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are a whole bunch of other different things that basically bring up different, require a different kind of thinking and a different kind of skill set.
Mm-hmm.
I also include something I call tiny Tai Chi, which is a very, very simplified version of Tai Chi that we
Mm-hmm.
do.
Mm-hmm.
And then also a movement process, which is called I Chuan, which is also an Eastern based movement system.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Is there anything else you want to say about your work, or you
Yeah,
want to
I
pass on to our audience who would be teachers, students, and people who don't know
sure.
anything about the Alexander technique?
Yeah, I think the thing about the technique is it's really, for me, it's a way of experimenting.
Mm-hmm.
It's a way of learning through paying attention to yourself in addition to paying attention to what yourself is doing in the world. In other words,
Mm-hmm.
you're noticing what's happening to you as you're doing things. I have a thing I call the primary concern, which is a sort of a fundamental sort of expression of an experiment. It's what happens to me when I blank?
Mm-hmm.
What happens to me? How do I change as I bring my arms up? How do I change as I mow the lawn? How do I change as I play the violin? All of
Mm-hmm.
those things, rather than saying, how does the violin sound? Am I getting the lawn mowing done? It's about seeing how the choices you're making about what you do are affecting your ability to do things or the quality of your coordination, your use.
Preconceived ideas of what you need to do what you're going to do, right?
That's right.
Yeah, and that's a really, that's a big thing for, well, certainly I've run into that a lot with singers, um, but just in general, people have a preconceived idea of just how they need to arrange their bodies
That's
in
right.
order to do this task that they're about to do.
Yeah.
And more often than not, a lot of that rearrangement is getting in the way of doing it as efficiently as possible.
Yeah. And we
So
habituate to that getting in the way so that we don't even notice that we're getting in the way. And
legitimate singing requires a certain amount of tension in standing, for example. Uh, that
right.
sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you want to add before we come to a close?
No, I think just to the main thing is to learn how to be exploratory with your own movement.
Hmm.
If you have something that is troubling you as a problem, either something that you can't do or a pain that you want to get rid of, have the confidence to know that there are ways of experimenting with yourself that
Hmm.
will in themselves help those activities. When
Hmm.
you learn to be sensitive to what you're doing with yourself, and you
Hmm.
have something to do when you specifically when you find yourself interfering with your coordination,
Hmm.
those two things can come together and you can use what Alexander discovered to improve the way you do just about anything.
Yep. Yep. All right. That's great. So my guest today has been Mio Morales, and I will put a link to his website by the interview where you can learn more about his teaching and his classes and how to sign up, I assume, for
Yep,
whatever
sure.
classes you got going when the person listens to this interview.
That's right.
Mio, thank you so much. Good to
It's
talk to you.
it's good to see you, Robert.